My name is Brian Higgins, and I'm a senior consultant with SSP. Been with SSP now about 4 years. Been able to have the privilege of working with Dean Perry. But here I guess it's a privilege to work with Jeff Puteriff up here today. Jeff's our DBA. Jeff's been our DBA for 6 years. What we're going to do is compare and summarize the database options, the databases that are compatible with the utility network. And we're not going to make a blanket recommendation in terms of like Oracle is the bee's knees, SQL Server is the way to go. No. To be quite honest, it really doesn't matter what you choose because a lot of the options, a lot of the functionality is the same. And the way, just how they do it's just a little different, and we're going to go through that. Okay? If you learn anything from this, is know this, that an organization can be successful with most any choice, whether it's Oracle, SQL Server, Postgres, but it can also fail with any choice. So the items that make the enterprise database successful are three things. The people that interact with it, the people that work with the database, the processes and the individual procedures. And we're going to go through each one of these. First is the people. The GIS administrator. These are your data managers, yours truly. Pretty much work with our catalog to set up the data model, configure the data model, make updates as software updates dictate the database update, exporting to file geodatabase for disconnected offline utilization, and management of replicas. Now I'm going to cut on my friend here. Jeff, DBAs don't understand GIS, don't understand spatial data.
I do.
No, you don't.
I do.
No, so actually, he's the best, all joking aside. But typically, DBAs focus on the data. They're going to interact with the database-specific tools for troubleshooting, interaction, managing backups, importing as necessary, restoration, linking of remote servers. Okay? Also, people that interact directly with the data are your end users. Your end users don't care whether you're using Oracle SQL Server, as long as the system works. So if you don't hear from them, you know the DBAs know they're doing a good job. Just basically going to just leverage the data to get out of the GIS what they want. Where the integrators are going to build your tools that consume the data. They're going to build applications. And I always get hung up, and we've got a kind of a joke. Your integrators are your programmers. So they're going to need that flexibility on the back end. Now, the processes that we're going to talk about with the DBA. Obviously, backup. Backup restoration procedure on your production server. Okay? A disaster recovery plan. And testing that plan. All right? How many people actually have a disaster recovery plan and has actually tested it to make sure it actually works in the event that you need it? Thank you. So, nice. You know. So, lastly, maintenance, rebuilding of the indexes. Every time an addition, a deletion is done to the database, the indexes are being modified, shuffled around. Over time, they get fragmented. The more fragmented the indexes become, the less your performance. You get a performance degradation. So rebuilding these reorganizes them into a logical fashion. Statistics, updating the statistics. Statistics are your cliff notes for your database. When you're doing database queries, if you have updated statistics, you can consider them like a shortcut, being able to quickly navigate to the information that they need. If those statistics become stale on your database, then again, performance goes down. Lastly, SSP as a product. You've seen it advertised all day yesterday. SSP maintenance. It does a lot of these, a lot of functionalities to keep your database tuned up, running like a finely tuned machine. That'll automatically do your compress, rebuilding your indexes. Okay, some of the procedures we're going to talk about is the refreshing of your test dev environment. Productions being is very dynamic. Okay, your tests and dev systems can become out of date. Refreshing those periodically are important. Troubleshooting. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems that we had, but the DBAs will do some tracing. Being able to find out where problems are occurring, identifying queries, and literally long-running queries that take a long time. Maybe there's an issue there. And last is performance monitoring. When we're making changes, upgrades to your system, how is that impacting performance of the database? Now, Jeff and I have a fun history. Since I told you I've been working with SSP now 4 years. Problems that come up when I'm on site in front of a client. I do a lot of traveling. Some of the most common problems, and we were arguing about this when we were preparing, probably the most common problem that I see is permissions. You know, permissions issues. And Jeff, you know, but is where I'll actually pick up the phone and call the man. And every time I do, we always say I owe him a beer. I owe him a truck by now. But data corruption issues. Now, these can be introduced by hardware, software, or individual users just screwing up. And lastly, performance. Performance hits is when, you know, that's when I call the man. But I'm calling the man right now. He's going to get up and we're going to kind of dive into some of the database recommendations or discussions.
Thanks, Brian. I got to say, you standing up here with that glass kind of reminded me of like the drunk uncle that nobody talks about at a wedding, like he's going for the microphone. Oh, dear God, he's going to make a toast. Don't let him up there.
The running joke was last year, it was so hot up on stage that I just about hit the deck. Watch the video. And so I said I wasn't going to let that happen again. So, whatever.
No, you did great. All right, so like Brian said, we're not going to come up with a blanket recommendation of here's the best database to use, period. As a good consultant, that would just be a bad thing for us to do because then we wouldn't be able to come in and analyze your situation and come up with that recommendation. So as a good consultant, the kind of thing that we'll come in and do is we come in and we'll say, okay, do you have experience with a given database technology, right? Do you guys have DBAs that are properly trained on Oracle or SQL Server? What other systems do you have that may be running that technology? Do you have an OMS that's using SQL Server or Oracle? Those kinds of things. So these are kind of some of the questions that we would ask before we can come up with a database recommendation for you. Okay? That said, the focus of this conference has been about moving forward with the utility network. So what we want to do is we want to start talking about the supported databases for the utility network and what differentiates those from each other so that we can kind of see what features of each database may differentiate these technologies. Because like Brian said, they're all very, very similar, but they do some things in different ways, right? So we'll jump in with, again, so moving forward, the utility network is going to support Oracle 12.1. It's going to support SQL Server 2016, Postgres 9.5, and SAP HANA. So we're going to kind of break these databases down and what differentiates them. We're going to start with Oracle. Oracle has a technology that really none of the other databases can match, and that's called a real application cluster, or RAC. What RAC allows me to do is it allows me to have multiple servers that are serving up one database instance. I have a shared set of data files that are going to reside on a SAN somewhere. It's a common storage. And every node that I attach to this is going to be hitting the same data files. So it's one consistent response every time you ask a query of the database, right? The beauty of this is scalability, number one. As I add more users, as I add more departments to my database, I can just add another node and another node and another node, and it's going to scale out linearly. There is a small performance hit because these things have to talk to each other to see if one of them has already answered a given query. So there is a little bit of an overhead in that, but that scalability still holds, and you can support 300, 400, 500 users very easily as you just add more nodes to this kind of a system. The other thing this gives us is high availability. Any one of these nodes, as I'm adding nodes to my cluster, any node can go down, and the other nodes are going to continue to respond to the queries, right? So this gives me that high availability that most people are starting to look for in their GIS. Okay? So the next technology that Oracle gives us is another thing called Data Guard. It's a little bit different than the rack, and what this does is it gives me some flexibility. Data Guard is going to have two completely separate servers, right? Separate sets of data files, and it's going to keep these in sync. So as a user edits data in the primary active server, Oracle's going to take those redo logs and it's going to ship them over to the passive server in a backup mode. I can do this in several different ways. I can have multiple nodes, right? So I can have another server in my same data center, right? And that's my high availability. If something happens to this first server, the second server will take over and it will respond to all the queries. And that can be an automated process. So as soon as you set up a monitor, as soon as that monitor detects that the first node goes down, everything rolls over to the second one. I can also then have another data center miles apart, miles away, and I can use that as my disaster recovery site. So if that whole building were to go down, the other building is still safe miles away, I have a data disaster recovery solution, and I still have not missed a beat with my database. It's going to keep those in sync. And you can combine these technologies, right? So I'll give you an example. PG&E out in California, they have a setup where their primary server is a two-node rack. Their backup is a two-node rack in another data center across town, and then they use Data Guard to ship between them. So you can combine these technologies for a true high availability and disaster recovery type of solution. Okay? From a DBA perspective, what Oracle gives me, some of the tools that I use all the time with Oracle. First and foremost is an Oracle trace. If you ever call Esri with a problem, one of the first questions they'll ask you is, can you get me an Oracle trace? Can you get me a trace of what's going on? What an Oracle trace is Oracle will capture every SQL statement from a given session, right? And then it's going to also tell me how Oracle is responding to that query, what wait events it's occurring, what wait events that database is waiting on to respond to those queries, how long it took to respond to the query, how Oracle responded to the query, so how it joined certain tables, those kinds of things, whether it used an index or whether it did a full table scan. All of that's going to come out in that Oracle trace. Very, very useful tool when Brian calls me up because he's having a problem. I can trace it for him, and we get the answer pretty quick. Another technology that Oracle has, by default, when I create an Oracle database, every hour, Oracle's taking a snapshot of what's occurring on that system. It's writing down how many sessions I have, my CPU utilization, my top wait events, my top running queries. It takes a snapshot of all of that information and it stores it in the database every single hour. I can then generate what's called an AWR report, an automated workload repository report. And I can tell it, I can say, start my report at 7 a.m., end it at 5 p.m. And I want to see everything that happened on my database between those hours. And it's going to combine those statistics into one report for you. It's a nice HTML formatted report. I have several customers that I set up that their database emails me those every day. So that's how I start my morning, with some coffee and some AWR reports. Sad to say. You know, that's just what I do. Those AWR reports are great, though, for finding performance issues before they occur, because I can start seeing that CPU utilization going up each day. It's also great for capacity planning, because I can look at those reports and say, well, yesterday we ran about 60% or 70% capacity on our CPUs. We might need to start adding some resources before our users come to lynch us, right? So it's great for those kinds of things. The Enterprise Manager. Oracle has an Enterprise Manager product that it's a cloud-based tool, and what it does is it's for monitoring and managing all of your Oracle databases across the enterprise. As long as you can install an agent on that server that will talk to the Enterprise Manager server, you can do everything from the Enterprise Manager. You can run your backups, you can create users, you can run imports and exports, you can do all of those things from the Enterprise Manager. And at a single database level, Oracle includes what's called a DB console. It's the same concept as the Enterprise Manager, but it's just for a single given server. The last thing that most people don't realize, Oracle has a tool called SQL Developer. It's a free download. It's a fantastic tool. Most people don't realize that there's a DBA view within that tool. If you just go to the pull-down menu and go View DBA, you get this nice little window here where I can set up my database configuration. I can change any Oracle parameter from here, assuming you have the permissions when you make that connection. That's kind of the key. But I can run all my data pumps from within here. I can run Oracle RMAN backups. I can schedule jobs. The resource manager is nice. I can go in there and I can say, Brian Higgins doesn't know how to write a query, so I'm going to limit him to 10% of the CPU, right? So I can set up a resource manager, just not that I would, but just for you. The tuning is nice down here. Tuning will give me real-time statistics on that Oracle database and show me which queries are currently running and how it's responding to those. So it's a real-time activity monitor. Okay, that's it from an Oracle perspective. We'll talk about that next one, SQL Server. So SQL Server has something very similar to Oracle with its high availability and disaster recovery. SQL Server has two different things. The first one is called an always-on failover cluster. This uses Windows Server clustering, and what it is this is an active-passive situation. So my data files reside on a SAN. My active server is running all of my SQL Server queries. My passive server is simply watching the active server. And if anything goes wrong with that active server, the passive server is going to take control, and it's going to consume those data files. It's going to start responding to all the database queries. It's going to become that active server. This is great for high availability of the server itself. So if anything goes wrong with the server, it's going to take over. It's great for the instance, so I can replicate just an instance if I want to across there, and at the database level. So if anything happens in that database, we can switch over to this other node. Okay? The next technology that they have, apparently they're like Sky. They like to label things kind of similar. But SQL Server has what's called an always-on availability group. This is different than the failover clustering. And what this gives me is database protection at the database level. So I can replicate just my GIS database over to another server if I want to. The nice thing here is that I can set up multiple targets. So I can have server number 2 in my data center and just replicate the GIS data. I can set this up as a read-only access so that I can now set my SQL server or my ArcGIS server connections to this guy instead of my active maintenance database. That allows me, Esri loves their exclusive access when you need to make model changes. That takes the ArcGIS server out of that equation. The other thing that I can do is I can have multiple targets. So I can have another data center across town so that if anything goes wrong, we can still have that active data center across town. Okay? So again, some of the DBA tools that we use on SQL Server databases. The profiler. This is equivalent to Oracle's Trace. It captures all the SQL statements, tells me how SQL Server responded to those queries, how long it took. I can go back in and I can filter that data. So I can say, show me all the queries in this trace that took over 2 seconds or over 1 second. Show me all the queries by B. Higgy, right? Because I know these are bad queries. Sorry.
I love the confidence.
You asked me to do this with you. So the second thing that SQL Server gives me is what's called an RML, or Replay Markup Language utility. This is something that was actually created by the SQL Server implementation team, and they decided to make it available to the public. What RML allows me to do is take that trace file and go back and replay it on either the same server or a different server. As long as they're similar data structures, it's going to work. That's great for if you want to do before and after comparisons of patches, hot fixes, any of those kinds of things, any kind of maintenance. Or if you're having trouble with your production server, you can restore that production somewhere else and replay a trace file on a different server now and see if you can reproduce the error there and work on it on a non-production situation. So RML is very, very powerful stuff. It's pretty cool. The last thing that we use from a DBA perspective is what's called PerfMon, Windows Performance Monitor. There's a whole lot of database-specific statistics that Windows will capture. So if you just go into the Windows PerfMon, you can capture anything about what's going on with your database. Number of commits, how long commits are taking, how long transactions take to write, things like that. So very powerful stuff. The last thing, and this is Brian's single favorite tool, this is the tool that makes Brian feel qualified to be a DBA, is the SQL Server Management Studio. Right? This is a full GUI for management within that SQL Server database. You can do everything right from here, backups, restores, creating users, fixing permissions, all of that stuff. Everything occurs right within that tool. You no longer have to be a command line junkie. The last database that I'm going to talk about is SAP HANA. Full disclosure on this, when Brian asked me to do this presentation, I got excited because I know SAP HANA is kind of one of the up-and-coming databases that supports the utility network, but I've never worked with it. I don't know of anybody that's using it in production right now. I've never gotten my hands dirty with it. So that was the first thing I did. As soon as he asked me about this, is I went out and I downloaded HANA and I tried to install it, 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 and I couldn't do it. I've been working with GIS Databases for how many years now, and I could not make SAP HANA work. So this is all kind of a, take this with a grain of salt. It's not something that I've gotten my hands dirty with because I couldn't make it work. But SAP HANA does have high availability. It will do system replication, so it's going to take that entire database and copy it over somewhere else. It will do storage replication. So the storage replication is nice because you can have multiple places that you're backing up that database, replicating that database for storage. And it does support auto host failover. Right? I think we're up to you now? So absolutely. One of the things that Brian alluded to is that he calls me a lot with these kinds of problems, these database problems, and he always says, put the beer on my tab, right? Put the beer on my tab. He has yet to actually pay that tab.
That is true.
And I won't say that he's a cheapskate. I won't go that low. But the next couple of databases that Brian wants to talk about are in his price range.
So I don't know quite how to take that because now I get all the cheap or free databases. I'm also a little concerned. You had a lot more photographs of you than, so I don't know how to take that. But anyway, SQL Server Express. As we talked about, it's free. It's a free database, but it's an example, you get what you pay for, okay? What's cool, and Jeffrey was right, that you do get the full SQL Server Management Studio. It makes me feel like a DBA sometimes. It is a viable option for small utilities, but you get the database size is limited to 10 gigabytes. That is the catch. So currently, we deployed that for Zia Natural Gas, and they're hitting about one gigabyte. So it is definitely a very viable alternative. Now, I do have a question. I'm curious. Is anybody played with Postgres here in the room? We got 1, 2. It's like an auctioneer, but that's cool. 2, okay? It's a very viable, free, open source database solution. What's cool, there is 0 database limitation in terms of size. In fact, it's 32 terabytes for now. Another thing, on our website, I got to playing. I wanted to work with it myself and prove that's a very viable alternative. There's 3 blog posts. The enterprise, just getting the enterprise database working, get schema owner and establishment of permissions, and lastly, a backup restoration procedure. If you have not read this, by the way, does anybody read these? Come on, at least make me feel good, you know, so.
Read Jeff's.
Okay. How about if I put his name on it, you know, good answer. But Postgres, we've talked about the backup restoration procedure. Postgres uses what's called hot standby, and it's write-ahead logging, where as changes are made to the database on the primary server, those changes are passed over to the standby server as log files. So naturally, you get a point-in-time restoration by this procedure. Now, the negative. There is no native failover where if the primary server goes down, okay, there's no automated way that kicks on that secondary server and you're off and running. Okay, there are third-party applications that can monitor the health of the primary server. So just something to think about with the use of Postgres. Now, we talked about 4 or 5 viable alternatives for the database. There's a lot of reasons to switch. It is not hard to migrate a database from Oracle to SQL Server. It's not hard, okay? In fact, I was talking to an individual earlier about that's considering doing this. Okay, literally, it's selecting the objects, feature data sets, and dragging it over to in our catalog. Not hard, okay? A lot of reasons. Cost, things to consider. SQL Server is sometimes cheaper. Things to consider. Integrations with other systems. Other systems sometimes require a different database platform than others. Okay? Possible and negative. Got to be at state 0. If you want, for the database, okay, by doing the procedure that I described, if there are versions or you're not at state 0, you're going to lose them. You're going to lose those versions. That is a negative. Unless SSP has, of course, SSP has a product. We have a product called SSP Replay, where those versions can be backed out of the database, get to state 0, migrate over to your destination database, and replay those versions. Works like a champ. So there is a way to do it. A couple blog posts, of course. Documentation where this has been done, City of Houston and eWeb up in Oregon. So now, I'm also curious about something. How many people have made a database connection and wondered, what the heck is Demang? Yeah, I did. I did this, and so as Jeff was saying, I was excited, kind of preparing. So what I did a little homework on some of these other database connections, these other database types, okay? We've already talked about Oracle, Postgres, and SQL Server. We've already talked about those. But what about these others? Some of these others, some of them are open source, but some things to consider. The geodatabase functionality is not always fully supported. Even though they're appearing in that drop-down list, they're not always fully supported. So, and the last bullet point, and the reason, the theme of the conference is the utility network. We gave you that list of 4 databases. You'll notice these databases are not on that. So just things to consider. So I think if you want to kind of bring us home.
Wrap this up?
Yep.
Yeah, so what we came up with was kind of a closing table here to address the different features within each of the databases that kind of differentiate them from each other. We talked at the beginning of this about how the technology is the same. So you can see that each of these databases support high availability. They support disaster recovery. They have very rich DBA tools and development tools. And they also have other things surrounding them, particularly with Oracle and SQL Server. They have REST services, they have reporting services. Oracle has Apex, Application Express, a very quick and easy way of getting data out to the web, out to the masses. So I'm not going to read the slide to you, but you can see that each of these databases has these functionalities, and they all each go about it in a slightly different way. So I hope that what we've done today is at least help you differentiate how these databases do that, how they handle high availability, how they handle the disaster recovery. Right? Any questions for us? We're close. We're close. Questions?
We've got some time for questions. Yes, Ed?
Yeah, Jeff, that was great. Thank you very much. So one thing you mentioned, Ryan, you were great too. You were talking about SQL Server and some aspect of the replication or backup process that helped minimize or avoid ESRI's requirement for exclusive locks while you're making schema updates. And I'm not sure I got all that.
Can we go backwards through the slide deck?
Does the DBA need help?
Without having to go previous? Is there a hotkey? Here, go backwards to my SQL Server.
I guess DBAs don't understand PowerPoint either.
So what this does, Ed, is I can have this secondary server, and I'm replicating this database across, right? This database is read-only, and the read-only, as we found out with Denton, the read-only starts at 2016, SQL Server 2016 or higher. I can connect my SQL Server to this in a read-only, or I can connect my ArcGIS server to this database, the replicated database, but it's a read-only process. That database is read-only. I cannot make any changes to it, right? So if I have SQL Server, or if I keep saying SQL Server, if I have ArcGIS server connected to it, right? This guy doesn't know that this has connections to it, right? So when you go to make a model change and you have to shut down ArcGIS server, right, because it wants exclusive access, you no longer would have to do that because your ArcGIS server is connected here, but you're making the model change here. And that model change would then be pushed across to here, so ArcGIS server would pick it up.
Okay, but you still have to get an exclusive connection. Kick off users. You
You
still
have to kick off the users, but you don't have to stop ArcGIS server.
Okay. I thought you guys were talking about a case where I wouldn't have to kick off the users.
You still have to kick off. You still have to have exclusive access to make those model changes. But the hardest part with exclusive access to make those changes is ArcGIS server. Because you have to take down everybody who might be hitting on a web or reading a collector or whatever, right?
Yeah, I think the biggest decision was for us when we were trying to work with our OMS data and not having to kick system ops off all the time or whatever to make changes. So we decided to work on a read-only, and then we'll make changes and just automatically just get thrown over.
Right. So we tried to set this up for these guys at Denton, but they're actually using SQL Server 2014, so we couldn't make it.
So that's only about 2016.
2016 and above.
Thank you.
Okay. Great question. Thank you. Any other questions? No? All right. We'll let you sneak over and catch the last few minutes of the cool tools.